Tomas Cambell began researching altered states of consciousness with Bob Monroe of the Monroe Institute before the term out-of-body experience had been coined. As a young physicist with an open mind, he launched himself into states of consciousness he had never believed possible, then spent the next 35 years researching the phenomena while working his day job developing missile defense systems. His summation of how we create and experience our own reality took form in a very large book titled My Big Toe, TOE meaning Theory of Everything, which also explains the telling of future events. Tom, you had an unusual start to this, what is now becoming your passion, and the very thing that I'm here listening to you lecture on. And that was in your earlier days, early 20s, right? You were a physics student. You were also a double major, physics and math, so you were a brainiac. But on the other hand, you were really driven by a deeper curiosity.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened in those years going into your association with Monroe?
Sure. I had just gotten out of graduate school, so that did put me probably, 26, 27, something like that, late 20s. And when I walked into my office, my boss at that time came in and he tossed a book at me and said, "Tom, read this." And I caught the book in my lap and I looked at it, and it was Bob Monroe's Journey Out of the Bodies. And I'm thinking, what is this? I've only been there a few months. Is this a test? And how am I supposed to act? So I did what he said, because when your boss says read the book, you read the book.
That's an interesting thing to have happen, actually, in that environment.
I was working for Army Technical Intelligence.
There you go.
Yes. And at that time, it was Foreign Science and Technology Center, since it's changed its acronyms a few times. But in any case, I read the book, and in a couple of weeks, I did my report, which I knew was coming, and I told him the truth. I said, how do you know whether this is real or whether this guy's just making it up? I mean, how can you tell? If he's not making it up and it's real, then that's like a wow. I'm a physicist, and what I do is I'm interested in reality, understanding reality. How does it work? And this is a whole nother phase, a whole nother piece of reality that I don't know anything about. So that's really exciting. On the other hand, if this guy's just trying to sell books by making up interesting stories, it doesn't mean anything. And, how do you know? How do you resolve that? So that's where it was until a few months went by, and the boss comes in and says, "Hey, we found out Bob Monroe lives just about 45 minutes out of town." I was in Charlottesville, Virginia at the time. And we've made arrangements to go see him. Would you like to come with us? And you couldn't have kept me away from that for anything, because I wanted to answer that question. Is this guy nuts or what? And when we got there, we drove into what was then Whistlefield Farm. It was about a 500-acre estate that Bob Monroe owned. Beautiful estate, house up on the hill, the manor house, Virginia country gentleman
so beautiful.
Style, very beautiful place, 2 lakes, whiteboard fence, horses running alongside the fence with the car, that sort of thing. And my first thought was, this guy's not in it for the money. For whatever he makes in books, it's a pittance compared to, what he already has under control because of this estate that he's living on. So I knew that wasn't it. And then Bob comes out, and Bob is just as likable and straightforward and honest a guy. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't trying to convince anybody of anything. He was just... He actually acted more like the engineers I was used to talking to. He was very straightforward, very scientific. He wanted things to make sense. So that was my introduction to Bob Monroe. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So toward the end of that day, Bob took us up to the lab that he had just built. It was an empty building, didn't have anything in it. And he said, and a bunch of us were all scientists and engineers. This Foreign Technology Center, we studied foreign technology to learn what we could learn from it. So I was working physics modeling at the time. So he said, well, you guys are all scientists and engineers. Would any of you like to help me, staff my lab and build equipment? And my hand shot right up in the air, because I'd been a student, all my life. And that's what you do when you answer a question, you stick your hand in the air. So I felt kind of silly sticking my hand up in the air, but that was what I did. And this other guy, Dennis Menerick, he was also he was an engineer. He was a double E, and I was a physicist. we both said, yeah, we'd love to do it. Everybody else sat there and looked at their feet, So Bob said, okay, call me up, and we'll do something. And then Bob went out of town. And eventually we did meet with Bob, and we did instrument his lab. We did do the equipment. We built equipment, custom built a lot of the equipment at that time. And we scrounged up other equipment that from the institutions of learning where we had, where we knew they had extra equipment. And Bob started to fulfill his part of the bargain, was to teach us how to do out of body and how to experience the things that he experienced. We wanted to experience them. Otherwise, we'd never know whether they were real or not. We had to have it as our experience, and we both knew that. And in my mind, I thought, well, the best thing that can happen was I'll learn some really neat things and have a lot of fun. The worst thing that can happen is this guy's bogus as a $3 bill, and I'll just leave. So that was my thought. Well, Bob was genuine. He was real. His experiences were real. He was straightforward. And he did teach us in some months, some years. He did teach Dennis and I both to go out of body whenever we wanted to, kind of on demand. And we actually, Dennis and I, primarily Dennis, I guess in this case, we came up with the HemiSync, which is now
That's what I was just going to ask.
the kind of the defining technology of TMI. That Dennis saw that at work in the library in a Scientific American by Oster, I think. This would have been, it was an old article. He read it in the Scientific American, and they were talking about entraining brainwaves in this article and about the research that had been done and the history of it and so on. And Dennis thought, let's try this, because we had been trying everything in the lab. Bob had these 4 hertz, 4 cycles per second oscillations just as he exited body. That was one of the artifacts of his going out of body.
Which is essentially like low theta, right?
Right.
It's
that's
where
low
you're not
theta.
in sleep, you're in a
On the border
conscious
of
state
sleep,
on the border. Yeah.
And he had these oscillations. So we, just as you said, we associated those with brain waves.
Right.
And we used the EEG, we measured them, and we did get brain waves, and we could actually see the oscillation on the EEG. Little patterns would oscillate. So we decided that, well, this would be a good thing to try. We were in the mode of just cut and try. It was all experimental to us. There was no theory.
Sounds so much fun.
There was no theory, and we had done everything. I had sat on a stool with 2 huge capacitors on either side of my head trying to oscillate the pineal gland. We did everything we could think of that would enable us to create an altered state that would then be one that you could jump to the out of body from that altered state. And we wanted to be able to reproduce it. We were looking for science. And so anyway, Dennis got this idea, and he made a binaural beat tape. He borrowed the equipment. He made the tape. And Bob was out of town that week. I think he was out at Esalen giving a program. And so Dennis came to the lab, and I came with him, and he put this tape on that he made. And we listened to it, and it was like, wow. That worked.
Did it take you there?
That was good, yeah. It just was so much better than the sound that Bob had been playing. He had a little sound generator that he was using, but it wasn't as potent.
Was it more like white noise in contrast?
It was pink noise, and he was trying to modulate that noise at the 4 hertz, so it almost sounded like brushes on a drum.
Oh, I see. Okay.
A little surfy, a little like surf, but a little more like drums, like brushes on a drum. But it was a modulated 4 hertz. You had a 4 hertz beat, which is that's about 4 hertz, and then that would rise and fall, sort of like with a 2 or 3 second, which was a delta. It had a low delta, but it had this 4 hertz riding on it, and it was a very pleasant sound. It was pink noise, but it was relaxing. That was its main function. This was more than relaxing. This binaural beat actually entrained your brain waves. And as we measured it with the EEG, we could see that the brain waves getting into sync. You start and you have some in everything. You have a little bit of theta, but you have more alpha, you have a lot of beta. And all of these energy spectrum are being triggered kind of at the same time. You're spread all over. And then you start playing this binaural beat, and suddenly everything falls away except the theta state, and the theta state grows. So that's what we noticed on the EEG. So then we experimented with it, and Bob came back, and he was excited about it too. And we went through a lot of experiments trying to say, what should the base frequency be? Was it really 4? Was it 3.85? Was it this? And we did experiments for months trying to optimize the effect of what worked best. Should you ramp